Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Newman, and I need first of all to make a big apology for not being present with you this evening due to completely unforeseen circumstances. I'm really sorry, but I know it's going to be an excellent evening, especially when you get into the small groups after our three introductory speakers and after Roger has said what is going to happen in the groups. So to get on with things very quickly, first the speakers and then a little of a Jewish introduction for context. Tim Crosland is a barrister who is going to remind us of the urgency of the global situation, a very informed and deeply understanding viewpoint. Jeremy Lent, delighted to welcome as well an Englishman living in San Francisco, who's going to give us an idea of the world as it could be. And finally, Dahlia from Carolath, who organised the Interfaith Bridge for Extinction Rebellion, will tell us why she is such a passionate activist. But as Ed said, most of the evening we'll be meeting in small groups, each of us finding our own answer to the question, what can we do? There's not one way. We might concentrate on our synagogues, where eco-synagogue gives a lead, or our place of work, or profession, or business, or in our local community, or even in our family. This evening, as I say, part of the evening will be introduced by Roger Hallam, and I do very much want to thank him and his team from Just Stop Oil for making this evening possible. As Judaism teaches, we can do much or little. As it says, it's all one, provided our hearts and minds are fully engaged. And why is this such a central Jewish responsibility? For me, beyond all else, we cannot be bystanders, given the precariousness of the global situation, what we are doing to the earth and to its climate, and to all of its inhabitants, human and non-human, the inequalities and the injustices. For me, the teaching of Micah reverberates. What is it that God, whatever synonym we would prefer, asks of us? The greatest thing that we could imagine. What is it that we are called upon to do? To act for justice, to love mercy, and to live our lives in humility, engaging as fully and as best as we are able. And now over to Tim Crosland, and many thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's so good to see you with us, and so good to see everybody with us. It's not an easy choice for a Tuesday evening. I don't think we've got any easy choices left. I want to be open straight away and say I'm not religious in any traditional sense, but my Jewish heritage still defines for me questions that are never far from my mind. My maternal grandmother was a German Jew, and her father was the architect, Adolf Wallenberg, who designed many buildings that are still standing today in Berlin. And after the first laws were passed against Jews in 1933, they fled to England via Paris together with my great aunt Ellen. I had a close relationship with my grandmother, and when she talked to me about what had happened, she talked less about the regime itself and more about the ordinary Germans who knew what was happening and did nothing. The people who'd been their friends, the people who lived or worked in buildings that had been designed by her father. And that's what she couldn't understand, and that's what she kept talking to me about. And so as a young person who wasn't being brought up as Jewish, I found myself imagining myself in the position of a German Gentile. What would I have done had I been a non-Jewish German in the 1930s, aware of what was happening? What could I have done? And that question never leaves me. It seems a long time ago now, but up to 2015, I was still a government lawyer. And that work took me to West Africa, where I learned firsthand about the impacts of climate change on Lake Chad, the primary freshwater resource for 20 million people across Chad, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. And since the 1960s, Lake Chad has lost 80% of its volume, and many, many millions have been displaced. And I then read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything. I then started to read more of the scientific evidence, all of the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I remember feeling like I was in some sort of horror movie. How could we know all this and stay fixed on the same path? It's like a kind of nightmare where you're being driven down the wrong way on a motorway and the driver keeps accelerating. And I left the government then in 2015. I went to COP21, the UN climate talks in Paris, and I was a legal advisor there to some of the small island states. And they'd commissioned research from the Potsdam Climate Center in Germany. And that research had made it clear that even with just 1.5 degrees warming, we're at 1.2 degrees now, their countries could go under. Beyond 1.5 degrees, the wet bulb temperature in the tropics will pass 35 degrees Celsius. That's beyond the capacity of the human body to cool itself down. And back in 2015, in those negotiating halls in Paris, the high-consuming world, in particular the US, EU, they were still focused on the 2-degree target. And that might all sound quite technical, but the message from the island states and others was, how can you ask us to sign an agreement which, according to the science, is a death sentence for us? You can't make us sign that. And so ultimately, the Paris Agreement included recognition of that 1.5 degree lifeline, but with nothing to hold countries to account for it. And now, as we speak, we are racing beyond 1.5 degrees. We have tens of millions of people in Pakistan suffering from the devastating impacts of flooding, while the oil and gas companies are making billions from the war in Ukraine. And Liz Truss announces today she will accelerate the licensing of new oil and gas fields in the North Sea and lift the moratorium on fracking. And just to stand back a bit, what's happening, and it's happening before our eyes now, it's not about projections or predictions, whole regions of the world are being knowingly turned into death zones, places where it's not safe to live, with increasingly draconian and authoritarian measures for those who are attempting to flee. None of this is a surprise. This is not acts of nature, this is human-made. We've understood the science for decades, and many have actively sought to conceal it and to sow confusion around the public debate. Now, that may not be fascist in its intent, but there is no doubt that human-made climate change is fascist in its impact because it is treating whole peoples, whole regions of the world, whole generations, and whole species as if they're dispensable. And that is a grim, grim picture, and so grim it's tempting to turn away. And the size of the task can seem overwhelming. But what does it mean if we turn away? What does it say about us as individuals? What does it say about us as a collective? Just a few years ago, Jeff, who's given us such a lift with his presence tonight, made a short film about the climate crisis with my son, Isaac, and my son's friend, Majid. And I remember him saying, power is not of the individual. Power is only of people working in concert together. And Jeff, I remember you quoting Rabbi Tarfon from the Ethics of Our Fathers, "It is not your duty to finish the task, but nor are you free to neglect it." We should be honest with ourselves about the scale of the challenge. We don't fix this by doing our recycling. We don't fix this by switching to electric cars. Fooling ourselves that we're doing our bit like that is just another form of denial. It's just another form of complicity. The climate crisis is a crisis of our democracy. Our so-called democratic institutions have been corrupted. Naomi Klein refers to it as the shock doctrine, as each crisis is used to bypass what would otherwise be democratic opposition to abhorrent policies. And so just as 9/11 was used as the pretext for war in Iraq, which we now know because the insiders have told us the real motivation was the desire to open up Iraq's nationalized oil fields to Exxon, Chevron, and others. So war in Ukraine is now being used to justify a deadly doubling down on fossil fuels. There is nothing democratic about it. Armed with good information, people don't vote for death and disaster. And so we face a stark choice, as Jeff has said, to be bystanders, to be complicit, or to join the collective resistance for an authentic democracy that harnesses our human brilliance and spirit to our collective survival. And I will leave it to others to say a little bit more about what that actually means in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was incredibly powerful. And thank you so much for joining us. You've been an integral part of this meeting. I'd like to give a little bit of context around who you are, just for those who don't know. So Tim is director of the charity Plan B Earth, which supports and advances, please correct me if I'm wrong, by the way, Tim, as well, which supports and advances strategic legal action to contain dangerous climate change and ocean acidification. Plan B Earth works collaboratively and internationally to bring strategic, high-impact interventions and ensures that those primarily responsible for greenhouse gas emissions bear the costs of consequent loss and damage. As such, Plan B Earth increases the incentives for investment in clean energy, which directs the market towards a better future. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here, Tim, so thank you so much. I will now pass over to Dahlia, who I will also give a little bit of context around. Thank you so much for joining us, Dahlia. Dahlia has a background in grassroots movement building and community organising, immigration law, refugee support and protection. She's a member of Bristol Women's Voice and passionate about women's rights, system change and earth protection. But I'll let you talk a lot more about that, Dahlia. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I feel like I need to take actually a little pause and a deep breath after. Thank you, Tim. You're always such an inspiration. Yeah, this is hard news and no news. I am a mother of two. I have two boys, almost 15, old boy Jonah, and little Yali is going to be 10 on Friday. And it is absolutely terrifying to imagine them to walk into a future that is terrifying to us. When I was 10, when I was 15, you know, I had worries around a girl no longer talking to me, whereas my boys are walking into a future that is entirely unpredictable. Unpredictable whether they're going to have clean water, whether they're going to have food even. But for me, my motivation and what resources me, even though I am realistic and I want to know the hard facts, I can't walk the path with this doom inside me. So I operate from a place of I'm here for life. I am here for life. I'm here for life. And within the Jewish context, what is my neshama calling forth? This beautiful creation. We are now in the month of Elul. We are walking towards Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, we're going to do Tashlich. Where am I going to do Tashlich? Here in Bristol? All the rivers are polluted. Sacred ceremony in sacred creation that is destroyed by the ways we are with nature, and it is sad. It's deeply saddening, and we are beyond sad because it's collapsing. I've been called back into activism in 2018, and my first affinity group actually was with ex-Jews, some extraordinarily inspirational organizers and activists that have brought forth with creativity, ceremony, ritual, and prayer onto the streets. We were occupying a corner on Parliament Square, davening. We did Kol Nidre in a park in London, and started the fast together. I was walking back to my accommodation and was then called into blocking, essentially jumping on top of a truck and staying there for the next 14 hours. And I was pretty much the perfect activist to do so, because I didn't drink, so I didn't have to wee, I didn't need any food. I was fine. All I needed was a blanket. I had my prayer book with me, and I was just there. And I couldn't, there was a question around, is this the right thing to do? Should I be sitting somewhere? Should I perhaps be in synagogue? Should I be at home, just quiet? And there was a strong sense in me, there is no better place to be than here. Here I am. Here I am saying my prayers in this place. And yeah, I hold that as it was deeply moving for me. Nobody around me really knew that that was happening for me. And I'm not really coming with facts or stats or answers. I'm coming with questions within the context of the Jewish community. So we pray for our government, right? We pray for our government. What are we praying for? We are praying for them to be infused with wisdom, to do the right thing. Now, this is an important prayer. So what do we do if they are clearly operating against what we consider law, the protection of creation? Where can we break the law legitimately, actually also within Jewish law? Perhaps that's a question for the rabbis to answer. Where are we called into resistance? Where is it permissible to say no? And in our own history, a people that has been in resistance for hundreds of years involuntarily. And when we didn't go into resistance, we regretted it deeply. Where's the law? Why are we not having these conversations? Let's start from a legal perspective. And, there are 2 Jews and 3 opinions. So let's sit with it. Let's really go for it. And I think as a collective, we are powerful. And we are also sending out a powerful message to other faith groups. And I think it is about collaboration. I think the eco-synagogues is a beautiful idea. And there's much movement within the communities, but these need to be bigger conversations, and we need to pull the power levers. How are we responding to this life's call? What is our responsibility? And as Viktor Frankl said, right, responsibility, responding to life's call. What is it we are called to do here and now for, this beautiful creation, our sisters, our brothers, our daughters, our mothers, us, and walk in deep prayer. That's what I want to be doing. Let's let this resistance be a prayer, a forceful prayer on wherever it needs to happen. Perhaps I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. You've always been such a force and with really powerful words. So I really, really appreciate you being here as well. Next, we have our final guest speaker, Jeremy Lent. I'll give a little context around Jeremy. He is an award-winning author and speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways towards a life-affirming future. He is the founder of the Deep Transformation Network, which is a global community exploring pathways to an ecological civilization, and also of the nonprofit Lyology Institute, dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on Earth. And I'll pass it over to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Matilda. And yeah, I'm just still holding what you just finished with, Dahlia, and that notion of walking in prayer. Like every step that we take can be a prayer in one form or other to connect us with what is most meaningful. And I grew up actually in the Jewish community in London, in Northwest London, but I've lived for most of my life now in California. And I'm speaking from Berkeley, California, from the Bay Area. And most of what I write about is about meaning. And what I want to talk about today basically is how, we've been looking at how deeply disturbing, how agonizing it is to see all this crashing, this devastation that is being caused by this climate breakdown and our institutions' refusal to do anything about it. In fact, they're doubling down on it. And oftentimes we get the response, well, what's the alternative? We all know that famous Margaret Thatcher, Tina, like there is no alternative, this notion, this is the only way we have. But what I really want to talk about is how there is a very positive alternative, a wonderful path towards human flourishing that's available to us, but only through recognizing how deeply this the pathologies of this dominant culture is, and by each of us in turn within ourselves and together shifting our way of connecting with meaning to a different pathway. So basically all the sort of books I write are about meaning. One book, The Patenting Instinct, is about how different human cultures made meaning out of the universe all the way from hunter-gatherer times to the present. And this most recent book I wrote is called The Web of Meaning, integrating science and traditional wisdom to find our place in the universe. And it shows how actually modern science shows us that this deep interconnectedness that we hear about from other cultures from around the world is actually not just something that it would be nice if it were true, but is actually what is real about the world. But our dominant worldview is the exact opposite of that. Basically, even though people don't sort of talk about it as if it's a worldview, they just kind of say, well, this is reality. This is the way it is. Worldviews are so powerful because they're not recognized as such, but they're a particular lens of seeing something. And once we see that lens is that, it actually makes things meaningful in a certain way, then it frees us to look at meaning from a different perspective. So our dominant worldview basically says that humans are selfish individuals, that all creatures are selfish. And in fact, selfish genes, we're told, are the driving force of evolution. And we kind of implicitly believe nature is just a machine. That's what science seems to tell us. And every organism's programmed just by its selfish genes to outcompete the others. And we're humans, because of our ingenuity, we've figured out how it all works, and we've outcompeted the rest of nature. And in fact, the modern world is this spectacular result of technology. It's enabled by the market forces of capitalism, which works so well because it harnesses that selfishness we all have. And it's actually continually improving in spite of what all these naysayers say. This is what we hear in the news almost like every day. And what's fascinating, though, is that science itself has invalidated basically every one of those statements I just made. In fact, nature's not a machine. Life is fundamentally and qualitatively different from any machine, primarily driven by a sense of purpose in every organism. And in fact, as life evolved on this earth, the great steps in evolution have arisen through increases in cooperation, not competition. And in fact, the most recent of those increases in cooperation came with the emergence of hominids, of our human ancestors. And we humans are not actually more selfish or more competitive than other hominids. We actually learned to cooperate in the savannah millions of years ago. And because of that, we evolved moral emotions. When we have a sense of fairness, cooperation, or altruism, and those are the things that actually enabled us to be successful as a species. And those moral emotions form the basis of the morality that characterizes our species. It's intrinsic to the human condition. And what's key is it's also driven by our identity. So this dominant worldview tells us that we're all separate individuals. And if you believe that, well, your values will lead you to pursue what is good for yourself at the expense of everything else. But if you identify with your community, if you identify with the rest of humanity, if you identify with all of nature, then you'll naturally lead to want to do different things in life. And so our crucial task is to incorporate this sense of this expanded identity into an integrated system of values that can redirect basically humanity away from that catastrophe and towards a future that recognizes this connectedness. This notion of like every step being a prayer, every action we take can connect us with this sacredness, with a deep interconnection of everything around us. And when I say that it's possible to find a path towards this flourishing future, where we have to go is recognizing that that is possible, but we need to change the fundamentals of our civilization, because our very civilization is based on that dominant worldview. It's based on accumulation of wealth. It's based on exploitation, based on extraction. And Tim was describing so well how this approach to climate breakdown by our governments and our major institutions is akin to fascism. It's also a continuation of the colonialism that got started basically in Europe hundreds of years ago, right when this dominant worldview arose around the 17th century or so. This is like one further step in this exploitation of those who are most vulnerable, including the non-human lives all around the earth that we share with. So more and more people are driven to this notion of what they call an ecological civilization, basically a civilization that would shift the basis of our values, not from one of like building on accumulation of wealth to actually setting the conditions for all life to flourish on a regenerated society. And people around the world are actually moving in these forms, in economics, in technology, in urban design, in agroecology, in permaculture, in education, in empowering indigenous communities to stand up for their rights, working in cooperatives and reclaiming the commons. In every one of these areas, what we see is people, even though it seems like all these things I described are all separate things people are working on, they're all working together actually towards a reframing of what's actually possible for our civilization. So what we really need to do is recognize that if we look at the absolute depths of how fundamentally our civilization is on the wrong track, that actually frees us up to then start to look at how we can work together to really regenerate our earth and recreate another form of civilization on this earth. And that is one which actually integrates both the spiritual and the scientific, and every other aspect of our life is one integrated whole. So I'm really grateful to be able to share these ideas with you today. And I think ultimately what I just would like to leave you with is this recognition that we need to look at how bad things are, just as Tim was describing so clearly. And we also, what we're called on from life, what we're called on from what is sacred in the earth is not to let that leave us in despair, but to turn us towards what is possible. And knowing that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to achieve what is actually possible for ourselves, but we do know that we're called on in every single hour, every single step of our lives, to walk in that prayer that Dahlia described, to connect with the sacred and to work together to make what is possible actually that little step more possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was amazing to hear your words there. And everyone as well. Thank you so much to our guest speakers. That was brilliant.
I just want to say it was essential. It wasn't only amazing. I believe that this is something which is really missing. Unless we have a view of where we're moving towards, what is possible, we don't know, we're blind. So I think what Jeremy says really fills a major gap in our understanding. Sorry, Matilda, but I just want to get
that's
that
absolutely
in.
fine. No, that's absolutely fine. You're absolutely right. It's very, very true. And the word there is right, it's absolutely essential. And with understanding as well. I'm now going to pass on to Roger, who is, well, I'll give a little bit of history to Roger. Roger Hallam. He researched the dynamics of mass mobilization at King's College for 5 years, and he was at the forefront of climate campaigning for many, many years, still is. He is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, probably the world's most high-profile climate crisis movement and international climate crisis movement. And now he works with Just Stop Oil, which, as you've heard, is co-hosting this meeting. His actions are grounded in a belief that peaceful public disruption is effective and justified in the face of social collapse as the crisis escalates. And he's also got some very powerful words to say. So I'll pass over to you, Roger, as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great honour to be here, and thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, I usually have the job of talking about practicalities, because that's what I do all day, is try and work out practically what needs to be done and mobilise people. But I'd like to just start with a few points, if that's okay. I think 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was an article in The Guardian. It was just a routine article, halfway down the page. And in the middle of that article, there was a sentence that just casually mentioned that by the middle of this century, scientists are expecting there to be 1.5 billion refugees. 1.5 billion refugees. And then the article just carried on. And it reminded me of a conversation I had with 2 of the world's leading scientists. I talked to quite a lot of the world's leading scientists, for better or worse. And I talked to the authors of The Future of the Human Niche, which is a major paper that came out, a peer-reviewed paper. And in that paper, it said at 2 degrees, centigrade, years of research has shown that will lead to 1,000 million people having to move from where they've lived for thousands of years, often. And then in the middle of the Ukraine crisis, the IPCC report came out, and buried in chapter 7, I think, there's another sentence that says that we need to be expecting up to 750 million refugees in Africa by 2030, in 8 years' time. That's the equivalent of 25 Pakistans. What's just happened in Pakistan 25 times in 8 years' time, according to the most prestigious scientific reports on the climate crisis. And just to finish off, I was invited to sit on a panel of with a bunch of Tory MPs, dare I say it. And Tom Tugendhat was there, who's, you may know, stood for Tory party leader. And I know he's on the public record as saying that he's privately spoken to the agricultural specialists at the UN, and they told him privately the following. They said, if you think Syria is bad, wait until there's 500 million refugees from Africa from the Sahel. So I'm saying this because this is already well-known information. It's well-known in the government circles, it's well-known in the UN, it's well-known in academia. But I'd like to suggest that the most shocking thing is not the facts themselves. The most obscene thing is our collective indifference to the reality of this suffering. And that's why I spend all my time trying to provide practical ways to overcome that indifference. And I can report that I'm increasingly working with people of faith who have decided that they have to overcome that indifference by moving into civil resistance, engaging in continual civil disobedience. And what they say to me is they're doing this because they feel like their deepest loyalties are being violated. And they can do no other than to move into resistance. So I'd just like to thank Jeffrey very much for working with me on this meeting and this project. And I've known Jeffrey for a long time, well, quite a long time anyway. And I'm very honoured to be working with him on this project. So thank you, Jeffrey. And we had a little discussion about, not thrusting Just Stop Oil onto everyone, as you might say. But just to be sort of clear, the projects that I'm involved in is the Just Stop Oil Coalition, which is bringing together people of faith, people with no faith, people of many different backgrounds to make the first practical step of not being indifferent, which is to demand the British government stops drilling and exploring and licensing new oil. And as you may know, the government's about to open 30 new oil fields. And we should be very clear that if we allow governments to dig up more oil and gas, we are standing by and allowing those thousands of millions of people to die. That's the world we live in. So there's 4 key pathways to action, which we're going to discuss in the breakout group. I think it's useful to be clear what pathways are. They're not generalizations. That I can do this, and I will do that. It's that sort of stuff. So the first thing is, as I'm sure we're all aware, the younger generation is under enormous pressure, an enormous pressure because of this reality. It's heartbreaking. And I work with a lot of young people. And many young people are now stepping up, giving up their university courses, not going into careers, in order to go around the country to speak to communities, villages, towns, cities, and tell people what's going on, but more importantly, what they can do. And Just Stop Oil has this major project. We've already raised £1 million this year to fund hundreds of young people to engage in this activity because they can't do it without funding. So we'd like you to give a donation to the Just Stop Oil Coalition to enable these young people to do that work. So that's the first pathway. The second pathway is to come to the next meeting, which is an easy ask, right? But it's so easy. And I've done hundreds of these meetings. It's so easy to just turn away and think, well, that was that. It's essential that people come again and talk about how they feel, what they want to do, about their despair and hopes, and say, what are our collective responsibilities and how can we support each other in taking the next steps we know we need to make? So there will be another meeting, and there's meetings of other faith communities and they're all working towards October, when thousands of people from lots of different organisations, Extinction Rebellion, Animal Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Greenpeace, trade unions and such like, different faith communities are going into central London to help demand that the government stops the obscenity of digging up more oil. So that's the project, come to that meeting. The third one is to go to non-violence training. Non-violence training is not about being prepared or not prepared to engage in civil disobedience. It's about allowing yourself to experience what it might mean for you to enter into civil resistance, into civil disobedience. And many people do not know whether that's for them until they actually go to that training. And it can be a life-changing event because it's the practicality of what it means to prevent evil from happening. So I'd encourage everyone to go to that. There's meetings every week around the country. And the fourth one is very simple, isn't it? Is we're not going to achieve anything with 25 people on a call. Everyone needs to go and talk concretely to 5 to 10 other people, your friends, your family, other people in your faith, and ask them to come to a similar meeting like this so that we can have dozens of meetings where we can explain what's going on and how we can respond to the violation of our deepest values. So those are the 4 things, and that will hopefully help us to concretize what our responsibilities are at this time. So I'd just like to thank everyone so much for coming on the call, and I'll pass back to Matilda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. You outlined that really, really well. I will, just before we go into the break, I'll repeat those, but that was great that you outlined them properly now. So thank you to Roger, and thank you so much all of our guest speakers tonight. Just to reiterate what Jeffrey said, everything that everyone said is essential. That is a good word to use.